to Kenya. Kenya's central bank made a surprising 100 basis point hike on the country's key lending rate to 10.5%, the first under the new governor, Kamau Thuge, who succeeded Patrick Ndoroje earlier this month. Kenya is battling high inflation, fiscal challenge of rising debt, and flagging revenue. I'm going to get more insight into this as we bring on Aly-Khan, who is the CEO at Rich Management Ltd. Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to talk to you again. Were you surprised by this rate hike? I guess was it consistent with your expectations at Rich Frontiers?
Well, I think the situation demanded it, but it was a bold intra-meeting hike. It's a way of the incoming central bank governor to, cement his monetary policy credentials. We'd seen some sharp moves within the market. 1-year T-bills had already risen to close to 12%. Infrastructure bonds had moved quite dramatically. So I think this was an appropriate response, but really market-led. The market was demanding bolder action, and I think the incoming central bank governors delivered that. And therefore, from my perspective, I think this is the right move at the right time, and it's the right signal to send to the markets.
So if I was to ask you for any key takeaways, is that the main thing? Is it signaling that? Is that the main takeaway from this move?
Well, I think signaling, I think you've already had a shift higher in the yield curve. And I think, you've had a pretty sticky inflation rate. So overall, yes, I would say it's a powerful signal to be sending. But the challenge for the monetary policy arm of the government is going to be the fiscal side, where we've seen a pretty expansionary budget, higher taxes. It's not clear to me we're going to collect all that money. So I think, the monetary policy is doing some heavy lifting in the context of a pretty loose fiscal environment.
Okay. Now, what are your thoughts on the new central bank governor? And I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Is it Thuge or Thuge or Mr. Kamau?
It's Dr. Kamau Thuge. Look,
yes. Okay. Excellent. So you said you called his move bold. What are your thoughts on this new governor?
So I think it's bold. It's ahead of the curve. It's putting himself ahead of the curve from a time when they'd been behind the curve. He is ex-IMF official. So I think we're returning to orthodox monetary policy. And I think he's going to prove a very, very solid pair of hands. I think if you take this signal in the noise, it's a powerful one. It establishes his credentials and bona fides, and I think it's the appropriate response. And I'm positive about it. The challenge is the cost of money in the domestic bond market carries on climbing. And it's really a question of how they can stabilize that situation going forward.
Very, very interesting. How does this rate increase play into Kenya's, current fiscal position and the financial markets? You mentioned the bonds, of course. What about, stocks? If you're raising rates, doesn't that make fixed income more attractive? And doesn't that lead to, bleeding from the stock market? What's your take?
Oh, the stock market is a comatose patient. It's been etherized on a table for more than a decade, and it's unlikely to make any kind of recovery at this moment in time. We're at a 10-year low, if not more than that. We've been there for a while. It's very difficult to see a recovery in the stock market, and I'll tell you why in particular. The Kenyan stock market has a foreign participation rate of about 40 to 50%. And currently, it's taking foreign investors more than 6 weeks to repatriate their money. And in that environment, most investment funds, etc., will be told just to get out because, no investment fund will accept that type of criteria. This was a problem in Nigeria as well, which you're now getting around. In Kenya, we have a 2-tier FX system. The supply of dollars is being throttled. I think the next bold move I would like to see out of the central bank governor is an attempt now to really say, let's find the clearing price for the Kenya shilling on the foreign exchange markets and get on with it. And I think if you do that, then you're going to that will be a positive catalyst for the stock market and overall a positive catalyst for the economy.
Thank you so much. And yes, thanks for mentioning Nigeria, because that repatriation of funds. We've even seen it in the aviation sector with airlines not able to get their money out. Do you think Dr. Thuge is done with rate hikes, or do you expect more? Because you did say at the top of the segment that inflation has been sticky.
Yeah, I think, look, a lot will depend, obviously, on a number of factors. One of them is the oil price. Kenya is an oil importer, so a lot depends on the movement of that particular price. We've had substantial tax increases, in particular VAT on fuel, which has gone from 8 to 16%. And therefore, I expect a spike in the inflation rates. I think he's trying to get ahead of that. I think he's going to have to go maybe one more time or two more times, probably in the same quantum he's gone this time, if he really wants to bear down on inflation, start inverting the yield curve, because there's going to be a massive call on the domestic bond market. And I think he's got to manage that yield curve. He's got to manage that situation effectively, and it had rather run away from the previous regime. We weren't selling any bonds. Undersubscriptions were, off the charts. Then all of a sudden, in the last few weeks, they've gone to a market-oriented approach. They got some very high, eye-popping yields, but I think that they're getting a handle on that scenario.
Ali, this is governance is so hard, because I got to ask you about this. You said the monetary side is doing a lot of heavy lifting. A lot will depend on the fiscal side. You did mention the budget, and there's the new taxes that are going up. You mentioned the fuel taxes going from 8 to 16%. So the fiscal side is they're raising taxes in order to raise revenue, but then there's an inflationary shock from that, which drives inflation up, which then probably leads to more rate hikes, yes, to try to get the same inflation down that's been that's been hiked by taxes going up. So how do you put all this together? It just seems like a circular issue here.
It feels like that. It feels very circular at the moment. I think, I would have far preferred to have seen a conservative fiscal approach. I think that would have then been able to sort of synchronize itself with the monetary policy scenario. But, quite often in many parts of the world, not only in the developing world, but in the developed world, look at what's happening, for example, in the US. You've got a very expansionary fiscal policy, and monetary policy is having to do the hard work. It's no different to in Europe. But so therefore, this is a complexity we see in many parts of the world. It's not unique to Kenya. But getting back to the inflationary side, yes, I think, it is inflationary, the budget that we've just had. It's going to require some hard work from the monetary policy side. And then the other worry is really the numbers that were in that budget. I don't think, they're going to raise the types of taxes they are predicting in that budget. And therefore, my scenario analysis is assuming quite a shortfall, then a bigger call on the domestic bond market to make up that shortfall, or a bigger call on the multilaterals. Kenya has become flavor of the month in Africa with the multilaterals. The IMF and the World Bank have been very supportive. That increase in the VAT rate I spoke about was something the IMF have been asking for about 15 years, and they finally got it under this administration. So there's a quid pro quo happening, and I think the multilaterals will lean into the current scenario.
Aly-Khan, Satchu, CEO, Rich Frontiers, it's always a pleasure talking to you. So informative on the goings-on in Kenya. Thank you so much for your time.